The autumn sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sky Harbor International Airport as a woman in her mid-40s walked purposefully through Terminal 4. She wore a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, carrying just a small leather backpack. Nothing about her appearance screamed billionaire airline owner. And that's exactly how Dr. Maya Richardson liked it. As the owner and CEO of Pacific Global Airlines, she had made these undercover flights a regular part of her management style. Today's flight from Phoenix to Seattle would be her third secret inspection this month. She believed in experiencing her airline exactly as her customers did. No special treatment, no advance notice to the crew, just another passenger trying to get from point A to point B. The gate area was already crowded when she arrived. Business travelers tapped away on laptops while families corralled excited children. Maya found a quiet spot near the window and pulled out her tablet, pretending to read while actually observing the gate agents' interactions with passengers. She noticed how they handled an elderly gentleman's seating request with patience, earning a quiet nod of approval from her. Her company hadn't always been a major player in the airline industry. 10 years ago, Pacific Global was just a small regional carrier with 12 planes. But Maya's innovative approach to customer service and employee satisfaction had transformed it into one of the country's most respected airlines. She had worked her way up from being a flight attendant, putting herself through business school at night, and eventually leading a successful buyout when the previous owners decided to sell. As boarding began, Maya waited until her group was called. Zone 1, First Class. Though she could have easily boarded before everyone else, she stuck to protocol. Walking down the jet bridge, she smiled at the ground crew member who checked her boarding pass. Inside the aircraft, the lead flight attendant greeted passengers with a practiced smile that Maya noted didn't quite reach their eyes. Mental note: review customer service training protocols. The first-class cabin smelled of fresh coffee and leather. Maya stored her backpack and settled into seat 2A, watching as other passengers filed past. A businessman in an expensive suit took the seat across the aisle, immediately donning noise-canceling headphones and closing his eyes. Two elderly ladies chatted quietly as they arranged themselves in the row behind her. Through the open cockpit door, Maya caught glimpses of the flight crew performing their pre-flight checks. The captain's voice carried clearly as he spoke with ground control, confident, perhaps a touch arrogant. She had learned to read people well over her years in the industry, and something about his tone made her take mental notes. Little did she know that this routine inspection flight would become anything but routine. As she watched the ground crew loading the last of the luggage through her window, Maya had no idea she was about to face one of the most challenging situations of her career, a confrontation that would not only test her personally, but would eventually reshape the entire airline industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. The flight attendants began their final preparations, checking seatbelts, and offering pre-departure beverages. Maya requested water, deliberately speaking softly to see how well the crew paid attention to quieter passengers. As the ice clinked against her glass, she pulled out her tablet again, this time actually reviewing quarterly reports. She had built this airline on attention to detail, and old habits died hard. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Pacific Global Airlines Flight 2765 to Seattle. The captain's voice boomed over the intercom. Maya settled back into her seat, prepared for what she thought would be just another quiet flight across the western United States. She couldn't have been more wrong. The flight attendants had just finished their first round of service in first class when Maya began noticing subtle changes in how the crew behaved. While they practically fell over themselves helping the businessmen across the aisle, their interactions with her felt cold and mechanical. She'd seen this before, not just as an airline owner, but as a woman who had worked her way up from the bottom. A young flight attendant rushed past, nearly knocking Maya's water onto her tablet. No apology, not even a glance back. Maya took a slow, deep breath. She'd learned long ago that getting upset never solved anything. Instead, she pulled out her small notebook. the same one she'd carried since her first day as a flight attendant, and made a few notes about improving staff training. The businessman across the aisle snapped his fingers for attention, and 3 crew members practically materialized at his side. More champagne, he demanded, not even looking up from his laptop. They scrambled to fulfill his request. Maya watched as the same flight attendant who had ignored her moments ago now offered the man a warm smile and asked if he needed anything else. Through the open cockpit door, Maya could hear snippets of conversation. The captain's voice carried that same arrogant tone she'd noticed earlier, now mixed with laughter as he chatted with the co-pilot. She caught a few words, something about these people thinking they could afford first class. Her hand tightened slightly around her pen, but her face remained neutral. 20 years in the industry had taught her the value of gathering information before acting. A slight turbulence rocked the plane, causing Maya's empty water glass to rattle. She pressed the call button, waiting patiently. 1 minute passed, then 5. The same flight attendant walked by twice, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Meanwhile, the businessman's every minor gesture brought immediate attention. Maya made another note in her book, this time about reviewing the airline's service consistency protocols. When a flight attendant finally approached, her smile seemed forced. "Yes," she asked, the question coming out more like a challenge than an offer of assistance. Maya kept her voice steady and polite. "Could I get some more water, please? And I noticed my tray table seems a bit loose." The flight attendant's response was barely professional. "We'll get to it when we can," she said, already turning away. But it was what happened next that changed everything. The captain, who had emerged from the cockpit for what appeared to be a routine cabin check, overheard the exchange. He paused near Maya's seat, and something in his expression made her instincts kick in. She'd seen that look before, that mixture of assumed authority and underlying prejudice. Instead of addressing her directly, he spoke over her head to the flight attendant. "Is there a problem here?" Maya maintained her composure, though her heart rate picked up slightly. Not from fear. She'd dealt with far worse in her journey to the top. No, this was the familiar tension of recognizing a moment when change was needed. She'd built her airline's reputation on respect for every passenger, yet here she was, witnessing exactly what she'd worked so hard to eliminate. The captain's presence seemed to embolden the flight attendant. "She's been demanding," the attendant said, as if Maya wasn't sitting right there. The captain nodded, looking down at Maya with barely concealed disdain. It was clear he already made up his mind about her, and nothing about her calm demeanor or professional appearance seemed to matter. Little did they know, this interaction would soon become a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire airline industry. Maya took out her phone and quietly began recording, knowing that sometimes the best way to create change was to document the need for it. The confrontation that was about to unfold would test everyone involved, but it would also open the door to necessary conversations about bias in the aviation industry. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker as the captain planted himself firmly beside Maya's seat. She could feel other passengers watching, some pretending not to notice while others openly stared at the unfolding scene. Maya had faced countless boardroom battles and business negotiations, but this confrontation felt different, more personal, more profound. "Ma'am," the captain said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound anything but respectful. "I understand you're having some issues with our service." His tone carried that familiar mix of condescension and authority that she'd encountered too many times in her journey to the top. Maya kept her voice steady and professional. "I simply requested some water and mentioned a loose tray table. Standard requests for any passenger, wouldn't you agree?" She maintained eye contact, her gaze unwavering. 20 years of breaking through glass ceilings had taught her never to back down from people who abused their authority. The captain's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to such composed responses from passengers he tried to intimidate. "Our flight attendants have reported that you've been difficult," he said, glancing around as if seeking support from other passengers. Most looked away uncomfortably, except for the businessman across the aisle who seemed oddly entertained by the spectacle. Difficult? Maya raised an eyebrow, her voice remaining calm but firm. I'd be interested to know your definition of difficult. Is it requesting the same level of service other passengers receive? Or perhaps it's expecting basic professional courtesy. She gestured subtly toward her still empty water glass. The captain's posture stiffened. He clearly hadn't expected this level of articulate pushback. Ma'am, if you continue with this attitude, I'll have no choice but to. He let the threat hang in the air, probably expecting her to cower. Instead, Maya pulled out her phone and began openly recording. Please, Captain, continue. You'll have no choice but to what? Her fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, not just recording, but sending quick messages to her executive team. Years of handling crisis situations had taught her to always be 2 steps ahead. The captain's face turned from red to purple. That's it. For the safety and comfort of other passengers, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane. He gestured to the flight attendant. Please call ground security and have them escort this passenger off the aircraft. A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. An elderly woman behind Maya gasped softly. The businessman across the aisle finally removed his headphones, realizing this was more serious than he'd thought. A young couple a few rows back began whispering and pulling out their phones. Maya remained seated, her posture perfect, her expression composed. Captain, before you make that call, I'd like to ask you something. Have you read Pacific Global Airlines' customer service policy recently? The one I personally wrote and implemented 5 years ago. The captain's expression flickered with confusion for a moment, but he pressed on. Ma'am, I don't know what you think you're implying, but I am the captain of this aircraft, and my word is final. Actually, Maya said, reaching into her backpack, there's something you should see. She pulled out a small leather wallet, the kind that held business credentials. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as she slowly opened it, revealing the gold-embossed CEO badge of Pacific Global Airlines. The captain's face went through a remarkable transformation, from anger to confusion to dawning horror in the span of a few seconds. The flight attendant, who had been reaching for the phone to call security, froze mid-motion. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the engines. Maya stood up slowly, straightening her blazer. Now, Captain, shall we discuss your interpretation of our airline's service standards? Or would you prefer to have this conversation with the board of directors? The captain's face had lost all its color, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. CEO or not, he said, his voice slightly shaky, as captain, I'm responsible for flight safety. And I've made my decision. He was trying to sound authoritative, but everyone could hear the tremor in his voice. 2 security officers appeared at the cabin door, responding to the earlier call. The other passengers were now openly recording everything on their phones. Maya could already imagine the social media storm brewing. Airline CEO kicked off her own plane. Well, if this was going to go viral, she'd make sure it served a purpose. You're absolutely right about one thing, Captain, Maya said, gathering her belongings with deliberate slowness. You are responsible for safety. But let's be crystal clear about what's happening here. She stood, her voice carrying through the cabin without shouting. I'd like everyone to note that a passenger in first class requested water, reported a maintenance issue with a tray table, and is now being removed from the flight. The security officers approached uncertainly, looking between Maya and the captain. They'd clearly never dealt with a situation quite like this. One of them had already recognized her from the company's leadership photos in the airport terminal. Ma'am, the younger officer started, then corrected himself. Dr. Richardson, there seems to be a misunderstanding. The captain cut him off. She needs to deplane. That's final. But his voice had lost its earlier authority. He was starting to realize he'd dug himself into a hole too deep to escape. Maya turned to address all the passengers. I apologize for this disruption to your flight. As CEO of Pacific Global Airlines, I regularly fly incognito to experience our service firsthand. Today has been, she paused, choosing her words carefully, particularly enlightening. The businessman who had received such attentive service earlier now looked thoroughly embarrassed. Several passengers called out words of support. The elderly woman behind Maya's seat had tears in her eyes. Maya's phone buzzed. Her executive team was already assembling at the airport. She turned back to the captain, who was now sweating visibly. Captain, here's what's going to happen. I will deplane, as you've requested. But I want you to look around this cabin and ask yourself, what will each of these passengers tell their friends about Pacific Global Airlines tonight? She gestured to the sea of phones recording the scene. How many of their videos will show a captain abusing his authority? How many will show a passenger being removed for requesting water? Is this the legacy you want to leave in your aviation career? The security officers stood awkwardly, clearly hoping someone would tell them what to do. The flight attendant who had ignored Maya earlier was now pressed against the galley wall, looking like she wanted to disappear. Dr. Richardson, the head flight attendant, stepped forward, finally finding her voice. Please, there's no need for you to leave. Captain, surely we can resolve this professionally. But Maya was already walking toward the door, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. Sometimes, she said, pausing at the exit, the most powerful response to discrimination is to let it expose itself. I'll be interested to see how you explain this in the mandatory bias training sessions that will begin next week. The cabin erupted in conversation as she stepped onto the jet bridge. Behind her, she could hear the captain trying to regain control of the situation, but it was far too late. Her phone was already lighting up with messages from board members and news outlets. By tomorrow, this would be more than just another viral video. It would become a turning point in airline industry history. As Maya walked through the terminal, a small crowd began to gather. Airport staff who recognized her immediately started making calls. The clicking of her heels against the polished floor echoed through the terminal as she headed toward the airline's main office, her composed expression masking the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. 3 members of her executive team were already rushing toward her, led by her chief operating officer, who had been overseeing operations in another terminal when he got her message. Dr. Richardson, he called out, slightly out of breath. We just heard what happened. The board is assembling an emergency video conference. Maya checked her phone. The videos were already spreading across social media. Hashtags like hashtag airline CEO discrimination and hashtag Pacific Global shame were trending. She had been prepared for this, but seeing it unfold in real time was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced discrimination and stayed quiet. Get me the personnel files of every crew member on that flight, she said, walking into the airline's airport office. The staff inside jumped to attention, their faces a mix of concern and embarrassment. And someone bring me a coffee. It seems I won't be making it to Seattle anytime soon. The airline's PR team was already flooding her inbox with suggested statements and damage control strategies. But Maya had a different approach in mind. She sat down at the conference room table and began writing her own message to the public. Outside the office windows, she could see the aircraft she'd just left, still parked at the gate. The passengers were probably confused, angry, wondering what would happen next. Her phone buzzed again, this time with messages from civil rights organizations and news outlets requesting interviews. Dr. Richardson, her head of HR, appeared in the doorway. The captain is requesting to speak with you. Maya looked up from her notes, considering the request. This moment would set the tone for everything that followed. Bring him in, she said, but first, make sure every camera in this office is recording. She had learned long ago that documentation was power. As she waited, she could hear the murmur of voices outside growing louder. Word was spreading through the airport. The captain walked in, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible anxiety. His uniform, so crisp and commanding on the plane, now seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Behind him, the flight attendant who had ignored Maya's requests stood nervously, her hands clasped tightly together. "Dr. Richardson," the captain started, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." Maya let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "Then perhaps it's time to listen." She gestured to the chairs across from her. "In fact, I think that's exactly what we all need to do more of." The room was packed now, executives, HR representatives, and legal team members all watching this crucial moment unfold. Maya opened her laptop, pulled up the airline's mission statement that she had written years ago, and turned the screen toward the captain. "Read the first line," she instructed quietly. The captain leaned forward, his voice shaky. "Pacific Global Airlines believes in the equal dignity and worth of every human being who steps aboard our aircraft." Maya nodded slowly. "Those aren't just words on a page, Captain. They're the foundation of everything we do. Or at least," she paused, looking directly at him, "they're supposed to be." Through the office windows, camera flashes were visible from the terminal. The media had arrived, but Maya wasn't focused on them. This moment wasn't about creating headlines. It was about seizing an opportunity to transform a painful incident into lasting change. "Now," she said, sitting up straighter, "let's talk about how we're going to turn this into a teaching moment for the entire airline industry." The next hour moved at lightning speed. Maya's office had transformed into a command center, with phones ringing nonstop and emails flooding in from around the world. The conference room table was covered with laptops, tablets, and coffee cups as her team worked to address the situation that was now making headlines across every major news network. "The videos have reached 10 million views," her social media director reported, scrolling through her phone. "Comments are overwhelmingly supportive of you, Dr. Richardson. People are sharing their own experiences with discrimination in travel." Maya nodded, but her focus was on something bigger. She had just finished a call with the board of directors, who had given her full authority to handle the situation as she saw fit. The captain and flight attendant still sat across from her, looking increasingly uncomfortable as they watched their actions being discussed on the news playing silently on the office TV. "Get me the training department heads," Maya instructed, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. "And contact every major airline CEO in the country. This isn't going to be just about Pacific Global anymore." The passengers' videos had captured everything perfectly, from the subtle discrimination to the blatant abuse of power. But what caught Maya's attention most were the faces of other crew members in the background, some looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. That silence was what needed to change. "Dr. Richardson," her assistant interrupted, "the passengers from the flight are still at the gate. They're refusing to fly with the current crew, and they're demanding to speak with you." Maya stood up, straightening her blazer. "Move them all to our premium lounge. Provide food, drinks, whatever they need. I'll address them personally in 20 minutes. She turned to the captain, who hadn't spoken for the past hour. "You'll be coming with me." The premium lounge was packed when they arrived. The businessmen who had received preferential treatment earlier couldn't meet Maya's eyes. The elderly couple who had sat behind her stood up as she entered, along with everyone else in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maya began, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed space. "First, I want to apologize for the delay in your journey. Each of you will be receiving full refunds and lifetime premium status with Pacific Global Airlines." She paused, looking around the room. "But that's not why I'm here." She gestured to the captain standing beside her. "What happened today is a symptom of a deeper problem in our industry, one that's been ignored for too long. Today, that changes." Maya pulled out her tablet and showed them the document she'd been working on. "This is our new zero tolerance for discrimination policy. It's being implemented company-wide, effective immediately. But more than that, it's going to be shared with every major airline in the country. The room was silent as she continued. Your videos, your willingness to speak up and stand against injustice, that's what's going to drive real change. Sometimes it takes a moment like this, captured and shared with the world, to open people's eyes. She turned to address the captain directly, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. You're not fired. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Instead, you're going to help design and lead our new training program. Your experience today will serve as a case study for every employee in this company. The captain's eyes widened in surprise. This was clearly not the punishment he had expected. Maya continued, sometimes the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons. Your choice now is simple. Help us create real change or resign. Looking back at the passengers, Maya could see phones recording again, but this time she welcomed it. Change doesn't come from simply removing one person who showed bias. It comes from transforming the entire system that allowed that bias to flourish. The next morning's headlines blazed across every major news outlet. Airline CEO transforms discrimination into opportunity for change. Read one. Pacific Global Airlines sets new industry standard, proclaimed another. But Maya wasn't focused on the headlines. She was already deep in meetings, turning words into action. The premium lounge had been converted into a temporary office space. Flip charts covered the walls, filled with ideas and action points. Civil rights leaders sat alongside airline executives, flight attendants next to diversity experts. The captain, still in his uniform from yesterday, was actively participating, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine engagement. We need to address the subtle biases, too, one flight attendant spoke up during the brainstorming session. It's not always about big confrontations. Sometimes it's the small things, who we serve first, how we speak to different passengers, even our body language. Maya nodded, adding these points to her tablet. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from other airline CEOs, some defensive, others supportive, but all wanting to know how she planned to handle this situation. They were about to find out. Our new training program will be completely transparent, Maya announced to the room. We'll share it with every airline that wants it. This isn't about competitive advantage, it's about human dignity. The captain raised his hand, speaking with a humility that wasn't there yesterday. I've been flying for 20 years, he said, his voice slightly rough. Yesterday was the first time I really saw myself through someone else's eyes. It wasn't a pretty picture. The room fell silent as he continued. I always thought I was one of the good ones, that I treated everyone fairly. But watching those videos, he shook his head. We need to do better. I need to do better. Outside the lounge windows, planes took off and landed as usual, but inside, something extraordinary was happening. Flight crews from other airlines had started showing up, asking to be part of the discussion. Social media was flooded with aviation professionals sharing their own stories of witnessed discrimination. Maya's assistant rushed in with more news. The Flight Attendants Union just released a statement supporting our new initiative. They're asking for similar training programs across all airlines. The PR team was working overtime, but not in the way they usually did during crises. Instead of damage control, they were focused on sharing the constructive steps being taken. Transparency was key. Maya had insisted on it. Dr. Richardson, a young ground crew member, spoke up. My cousin works for another airline. She just sent me a message saying their CEO wants to join your training program. They're willing to share costs and resources. Maya smiled. This was exactly what she'd hoped for. A ripple effect of positive change. She walked over to where the captain sat and placed a hand on his shoulder. Ready to help rewrite the training manual? He stood up, straightening his uniform. Yes, ma'am. But first, I owe you and everyone else an apology. A real one, not just because I got caught. Yesterday showed me that being in charge of an aircraft doesn't make me superior to anyone. The room broke into spontaneous applause. Someone from the back called out, "Now that's what growth looks like." Maya turned back to the group. "This is just the beginning. We're not just changing policies, we're changing minds and hearts. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But it will happen." 2 weeks after the incident, Pacific Global Airlines' main training center was buzzing with activity. The large conference room had been transformed into what employees now called the Change Hub. Wall-to-wall screens showed live connections with training centers across the country, and every seat was filled with airline staff from different companies. At the front of the room, Maya and the captain stood side by side, presenting the new industry-wide training program. The change in the captain was remarkable. Gone was the man who had let power cloud his judgment. In his place stood someone who spoke with genuine understanding of the impact of unconscious bias. "I never saw myself as part of the problem," the captain was saying to the packed room. "That's exactly why I was the problem. It took someone brave enough to stand up to me, someone who could have easily had me fired, to show me a better way forward." The audience listened intently. Among them were pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew from various airlines. Some had flown in specifically for this training, others joined virtually, but all were equally engaged. "Yesterday, a passenger asked me why I was still wearing my uniform," the captain continued, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "The truth is, Dr. Richardson helped me understand that taking away my wings wouldn't solve anything. The real change had to come from within, and now I have the chance to help others see what I finally saw." Maya stepped forward. "This isn't about shame or punishment," she added. "It's about growth. Every person in this industry, from the baggage handler to the CEO, needs to understand that we're not just moving people from point A to point B. We're responsible for treating every passenger with dignity." The screens behind them showed live feeds of similar sessions happening across the country. Airlines that were usually fierce competitors were now working together, sharing resources and experiences. The incident had sparked something bigger than anyone expected. A young flight attendant raised her hand. "I've been afraid to speak up when I see discrimination," she admitted. "I didn't want to cause trouble or lose my job. How do we change that culture of silence?" Maya nodded encouragingly. "That's exactly why we've created the new anonymous reporting system. But more importantly, we're changing the culture so speaking up is seen as an act of courage, not troublemaking." The captain added, "As someone who was on the other side of this, I can tell you, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is call someone out on their behavior. If someone had done that to me years ago, maybe I wouldn't have needed such a public wake-up call." The training session continued with role-playing exercises, group discussions, and real-world scenarios. People shared their experiences openly, some tearfully admitting their own biases, others discussing times they wished they'd spoken up. During a break, Maya noticed a group of veteran pilots talking with younger crew members, sharing experiences and insights. The walls between different airline companies and job roles were coming down. People weren't just learning, they were connecting. Dr. Richardson, her assistant, approached with a tablet. "The initial data from our passenger surveys is in. Customer satisfaction scores are up 40% since we implemented the new training program. And other airlines are reporting similar improvements." Maya smiled, watching as the captain engaged with a group of new pilots, sharing his story with humility and honesty. This was real change happening in real time. Not just policies on paper, but genuine transformation in how people thought and acted. The incident that could have ended careers had instead launched a movement. Airlines that had previously competed fiercely were now united in a common goal, making the skies truly welcoming for everyone. 6 months later, Maya stood at the podium of the International Aviation Conference, looking out at a sea of familiar and new faces. The room was packed with airline executives, crew members, and industry leaders from around the world. The past months had brought changes nobody could have predicted. When I stepped onto that flight 6 months ago, Maya began, her voice steady and clear. I never imagined it would lead to this moment. What started as a painful incident has grown into a movement that's transforming our entire industry. Behind her, screens displayed impressive statistics. Passenger satisfaction rates at record highs, discrimination complaints down by 75%, and employee morale scores higher than ever before. But the numbers weren't what made Maya proudest. It was the stories of real change. The captain, now head of the industry's new diversity and inclusion training program, sat in the front row. He had become one of the most requested speakers at airline training events, his story of transformation resonating with people at all levels of the industry. Last week, a flight attendant stopped a passenger from harassing another traveler. Maya continued. She didn't hesitate or worry about consequences. She knew her airline would support her doing the right thing. That's the culture we've built together. The audience nodded in recognition. Similar stories were becoming common across all airlines. The old culture of silence was being replaced by one of active support and intervention. Our training program has now been adopted by 27 major airlines worldwide, Maya announced. But more importantly, it's not just a program anymore, it's become a movement. We're seeing changes in everything from hiring practices to customer service protocols. She gestured to a group of airline CEOs sitting together. Competitors have become collaborators. We've learned that treating people with dignity isn't a business secret. It's a fundamental right that lifts our entire industry. The screens showed clips from training sessions, including one where the captain shared his story with new recruits. His words had become something of a motto. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest contributions. Today, Maya continued, I'm proud to announce the launch of the Aviation Equality Initiative. This independently funded organization will ensure that the progress we've made continues to grow. It will provide resources, training, and support to airlines worldwide. The room erupted in applause as Maya invited the captain to join her on stage. Together, they represented both sides of a story that had changed the industry. The person who stood up and the person who learned from his mistakes. 6 months ago, I was that captain who let power and prejudice cloud my judgment, he said, his voice carrying emotion. Today, I'm part of the solution. And let me tell you, this side feels much better. Maya concluded the speech by sharing a recent letter from a passenger. Dear Dr. Richardson, yesterday I flew for the first time in 20 years. I'd always been afraid of how I'd be treated. But from check-in to landing, I was treated with nothing but respect and kindness. Thank you for making the skies welcoming for everyone. As the conference hall filled with standing applause, Maya looked around at the faces in the crowd. She saw flight attendants who had found their voices, pilots who had learned to check their biases, and executives who had chosen to prioritize people over profits. The incident that could have ended in just another viral video had instead sparked a revolution in the airline industry. It proved that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from avoiding difficulties, but from facing them head-on and choosing to grow.